This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to this short postscript to our presentation on the authorship of Isaiah. And this is just going to have some random observations on Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. When we talk about Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, we might have a discussion more generally about the use of the Bible in the Book of Mormon, specifically the King James Bible. And Royal Skousen, he says pretty definitively that we see mainly King James text in the Book of Mormon, King James text of Isaiah and other scriptures. Now, with that said, there are some variances, and they're not all inconsequential. Some of them actually are interesting and meaningful. But before we talk about that, I want to show this little segment from Grant Hardy's book, Understanding the Book of Mormon, which I absolutely love. That book really kind of furthered my interest in the question of multiple authorship of Isaiah. And from that and some other things that Grant Hardy said in some other contexts, I got some initial exposure to resources, and that's how I dove into this big question of Isaiah authorship. But this little image here of Isaiah text in the Book of Mormon is fascinating because it's not a direct quotation of a lot of Isaiah texts, like a chapter. This is kind of an interweaving of Isaiah language into Nephi's teachings. And he is just, it's almost just this effortless calling forth of Isaiah language as he's teaching. And this is interesting because if you are Joseph Smith, how this would be hard to do if you are making it up as you go along, weaving in between, the words of Nephi and the words of Isaiah like this. And we see something similar later on with Abinadi as well. I love seeing the text of Isaiah highlighted in this way. Now let's talk about Septuagint passages in the Book of Mormon. So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Most of our biblical texts are not Septuagint-based translations. They translate from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. So the Septuagint wasn't really translated to, if my understanding is correct, it wasn't translated into English until about like the early 1800s. The time of Joseph Smith. And then, obviously it's going to take a long time to propagate out to everywhere. And we have a couple of examples here of text in the Book of Mormon where we see almost kind of a variant Septuagint reading in the Isaiah text. And this is interesting because how do you account for it? Do you have Joseph Smith sitting down with a King James Bible and copying from that, and then all of a sudden he looks over and remembers, oh my gosh, there's a word or a phrase in this Septuagint-based translation that I remember, and I think I'm going to insert that in instead here. It's when you imagine that, first of all, it's very unlikely that he had a Septuagint-based translation, like extremely unlikely. And then second, like this mental model of him consulting that for these couple of passages only, it's pretty outlandish, the idea that he somehow borrowed from a Septuagint translation that he had access to. Anyway, that does not fit within my plausibility structures. I think this is revealed. But there's also a good in-depth treatment of this issue that's found on the FAIR website, and I have a link to that here. When we talk about Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, I like to talk about Jacob, the son of Lehi and the brother of Nephi. What we have in the Book of Mormon is a narrative that Lehi and his family got their Isaiah from the brass plates. They start talking about it while they are kind of journeying to the land bountiful, and then it looks like they really undertook a deep study of Isaiah at that time. And that's when we get this bursting forth of Isaiah teachings and wow, all these insights and interpretations and so on and so forth. Jacob in particular seems to have become obsessed with Isaiah. He uses the Isaiah phrase, Holy One of Israel, until he is told the name of Christ in 2 Nephi 10. Nephi uses it several more times, and then the last time we see that Isaiah phrase, the Holy One of Israel, is in Omni. Holy One of Israel is the phrase that Isaiah used to talk about Yahweh, talk about the Lord. So Jacob was kind of imitating him, and Nephi to some extent as well, and then that pattern drops off in the Book of Mormon. 2 Nephi 9 is an epic preaching session from Jacob, and it reads like his imitation of Isaiah 5. You have a whole bunch of woe sayings. And it's kind of interesting. It really reads like he absorbed Isaiah and kind of internalized that style of preaching there and then did his own. He also shares some unique vocabulary with Isaiah. There are some things that are only spoken by Jacob and Isaiah and nobody else in the Book of Mormon. And I've highlighted some of those words. Now there are 76 unique words of Jacob, according to Marilyn Todd Linford's analysis in the book, The Book of Mormon is True. And I've highlighted in blue a few of those words that are completely unique to Jacob and Isaiah. And mind you, that study, a study of vocabulary like this, it's based on a simple search of terms. And if we were to do a more in-depth study, you could look at the various senses of the words as they are used and their context and stuff. But I think her study is a good starting point to see what is possible in these kinds of analyses. And I hope that as Latter-day Saints, we can do some more of these. And now Isaiah 53 as a historical critical hornet's nest. Isaiah 53 is my favorite chapter in all of scriptures. And frankly, I think that chapter alone is probably what motivated me to undertake this whole investigation into critical scholarship on Isaiah. Isaiah 53 is where we get what I believe to be the most direct and powerful witness testimony of the atonement of Christ in all of Scripture. And here we have a quote from Joseph Blankensop about Isaiah 53. He says, "It is no secret that the historical critical reading of biblical texts has fallen out of favor in large sections of the Biblical Studies Guild, not least among the English language practitioners. As long ago as 1976, David Kleins, in his literary study of the Suffering Servant chapter, I, he, we, and they, complained that Isaiah 53 has become a casualty of historical critical scholarship. It is not the only biblical text in that plight, but its injuries are more grave than those of many others." Now, why would the field of historical criticism zero in on Isaiah 53 and tear it apart the way they have? I would suggest a possible reason is that Isaiah 53 is an enigmatic passage that has traditionally been, I would say inappropriately, used as a tool for proselyting Christianity. It's a controversial passage, and you can see these snapshots of YouTube videos that honestly I find, I'm appalled by these things, of the use of Isaiah 53 to try to proselyte Jews. I would ask Latter-day Saints to look at those and please do not repeat that behavior. If a Jewish person honestly, organically comes to an understanding that Isaiah 53 is a prophecy of Christ, wonderful, if that's an organic process that they come to on their own. But I hope to never see a Latter-day Saint go out on the street with Isaiah 53 and confront Jewish people like we see in these YouTube videos. And this has been done inappropriately, honestly, for centuries. I suspect that is why Isaiah 53 has gotten picked apart so much. I think there are a lot of scholars who see it as being kind of a source of frustration in Jewish and Christian relations. And now the final slide of this postscript. And I want to talk about Harold Bloom and what he said about Joseph Smith. Harold Bloom was a literary scholar at Yale University, and he wrote a book called The American Religion, where he talked about American religious movements. And he was a critic of religion, and I mean critic in the sense that he analyzed religions. He said, "I do not qualify to pass on the rest of the Mormon creed, but I also do not find it possible to doubt that Joseph Smith was an authentic prophet. Where in all of human history can we find this match? The prophet Joseph has proved again that economic and social forces do not determine human destiny. Researchers have not established, to my satisfaction, precisely how much the prophet Joseph knew about Jewish esoteric tradition or Kabbalah, or about the Christian Gnostic heresies. One wants to know also just what Brigham Young had absorbed from these sources, since some of Young's speculations about God and Adam and on the ascent of the soul after death are strikingly akin to ancient suggestions. What is clear is that Smith and his apostles restated what Moshe Idel, our great living scholar of Kabbalah, persuades me was the archaic or original Jewish religion, a Judaism that preceded even the Yahwist, the author of the earliest stories in what we now call the 5 books of Moses. To make such an assertion is to express no judgment one way or another upon the authenticity of the Book of Mormon or of the Pearl of Great Price. But my observation certainly does find enormous validity in Smith's imaginative recapture of crucial elements in the archaic Jewish religion, elements evaded by normative Judaism and by the church after it. The God of Joseph Smith is a daring revival of the God of some of the Kabbalists and Gnostics, prophetic sages who, like Smith himself, asserted that they had returned to the true religion of Yahweh or Jehovah. If Smith was mistaken, then so were they, but I hardly know just what it could mean to say that the Kabbalists or Joseph Smith were mistaken. The God of normative Judaism and of the mainline churches at this time is rather more remote from the God of the earliest or Yahwist portions of the Bible than is the initially surprising God of Joseph Smith." This is kind of interesting how he puts Joseph Smith in the company of ancient Hebrew prophets. As Latter-day Saints, we often think of Joseph Smith as an American prophet, and we look at him through American lenses. But I think there's a lot of value in understanding how ancient Hebrew prophets operated, how ancient Hebrew scribal schools operated, how texts operated in ancient Israel, and all of those kinds of things. And those insights translate very, very well, and they're very helpful in terms of helping us understand our own modern scripture and how our own contemporary prophets operate. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.